How do you get the best image out of your smartphone camera? You need to have the right settings. That's not always possible if you're using only your smartphone. Today we're going to take a look at the Freewell Sherpa Variable NDs and see if these are the silver bullet to getting the best images. No matter what camera you're using, you should understand the different settings you can control in order to get the best looking image. If you're filming with a stock application on your phone, many of these settings are handled for you automatically. It's pretty nice. But if you want to maximize control over your video quality, you need to make sure your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO are all set at the right levels. Now, I'm not going to dig too deep into each of these in this video, but very simply, all three of these settings impact the brightness of your image as well as the amount of image that's out of focus. Very simply. You can get the full control over these settings if you're using an app like Cinema P3 or Filmic Pro, but regardless of how you're filming, today's tool is going to help you get the best settings out of your phone. The issue with these settings is that if you're filming outside on a bright sunny day, the only way your camera can get any image is to move these settings to a spot where more is in focus, which means you're losing a bit of the film look. Sure, you could possibly use cinematic mode if you're filming on an iPhone, but that's not a great solution for video where people are moving around fast. I find cinematic mode works best if I'm just filming a talking head like this with a little movement, and even then it can sometimes have issues if there's a lot of movement. The best way to get the shallow depth of focus is to set your aperture as wide open as possible, but if it's a sunny day out, then your image is going to end up looking like a giant blob of white light. So what's the solution? An ND filter. You can basically think of an ND filter as sunglasses for your camera. If you go outside on a bright sunny day, you end up squinting until your eyes finally adjust. Your camera has the same issue, but the problem is that the only way your camera can adjust is by changing its settings to a setting that puts more of your image in focus. It changes the shutter speed, which means the image is going to look a little more jumpy, and it changes the aperture, which means more of it's going to be in focus. If you use an ND filter though, your camera has a better chance of putting these settings at the correct spots. For reference, you usually want your shutter speed to be about double your frame rate, and your aperture to be as low of a number as possible. These rules are not absolute by any means, but they're a good rule of thumb. Enter the Freewell set of variable ND filters. These are two variable ND filters that are optimized for use with either an iPhone or a Samsung phone, specifically on the Sherpa line of phone cases. They offer two separate variable ND filters, a 1 to 5 stop filter as well as a 6 to 9 stop filter. Essentially, a variable ND filter means that you can adjust the strength of the filter to fit the amount of sunlight. Just a little sun peeking through the trees? Maybe you can get away with 1 to 3 stops of ND. Sun is out in full force? You might need to pull out the 6 to 9 stop filter. Just a note, these filters weren't sent to me by Freewell and were instead purchased using my own hard-earned money. The biggest feature that initially sold me on them is that they connect magnetically to your smartphone. Previous filters I've used either clipped onto the phone or they connected via a plastic mount. While both of these filters had their own strengths, I found they were often more clumsy than anything and I'd spend more time trying to get them to set instead of filming. The Freewell filters connect firmly and I used them heavily on a recent project and not once did I have any issues with them coming off. Both filters include clear markings indicating what level of ND you're currently applying. The filters twist smoothly but are still tight enough that you're not in danger of bumping them to change the strength. They include hard stops at either end of the filter, preventing the vignetting issues that you run into with many variable NDs. The filters are designed to be future-proof, allowing you to remove the base if there's any significant changes to the camera design of the phones. Now obviously time's going to tell if this holds true as Apple and Samsung continue to improve upon their cameras, but I really do appreciate that Freewell is at least considering how they can minimize waste and allow people to not need to buy an entirely new system with each new phone. Finally, the filters include a plastic case for storage as well as a rubber lens cap to protect the filter. The only thing I wish they'd included was some sort of rear cap that you could use, so I could drop the filter into a sling without needing to deal with a slightly bulky plastic case, but honestly, that's just me being nitpicky. The 1 to 5 stop variable ND filter is most likely the main filter you're going to want for your kit. Strong enough to handle most levels of sunlight, but also low enough that you can still utilize it when you need just a slight amount of relief from the sun. Freewell claims that these filters are designed to reproduce the most accurate colors of any filters on the market, and I have to say they do a solid job. The filters have a great look to them and allow you to set your settings exactly where you need them. The majority of higher-end ND filters I've used all require that you use a proprietary phone case, and the Freewell filters are no different. The Freewell Sherpa is the line of cases designed to work with these filters offered for both the iPhone 13 and 14, as well as the Samsung S23. I've been working with the iPhone 14 Pro case, and I have to say, honestly, I am impressed. The case has a solid feel to it, and I can attest to its strength as I've unfortunately dropped my phone a few times since picking up the case a few months ago, and it still looks as good as new. The front has a slightly raised lip around it to protect the screen from any direct hits on the ground. The sides of the phone are made of what feels like a rubbery plastic material, I couldn't tell you exactly what, while the back is a solid piece of plastic-like material. It's very solid though. The rear of the iPhone model includes MagSafe compatibility, so you can still charge your phone using a MagSafe charger or utilize any number of other MagSafe accessories. The buttons on the side have a nice clicky feeling to them, giving you a clear feedback when you push them. They also have more of a metallic feeling to them, giving the case a slightly more premium feeling. I wish I could tell you what these materials are, but they feel nice. There's also a small spot where you can attach a wrist lanyard or loop if you'd like a bit more security. The location of this is a great spot, as often I find that companies put these loop attachment spots on the bottom of the phone, which can interfere with certain chargers or phone stands. This one's close to the bottom, but located on the side, so it stays out of the way. Finally, the biggest selling point, the metallic filter mount on the back of the phone. The lens area is made of a metallic material, which allows the variable ND filters to attach magnetically. The lens cover is slightly raised, which also protects each of your camera lenses from drops and falls. To attach the filters, you just line up the logos and connect the filter. Once it's lined up, it clicks right into place. I have to say that I've been incredibly impressed with this case. It has a very premium feel, but comes at a very affordable price. The case is durable, yet not bulky. It feels great in the hand while giving a significant amount of utility. I was prepared to use this case only when I needed to utilize the filters, but honestly it became my favorite case and I've used it ever since. Before jumping into the tests, if you're interested in continuing to learn more tips and tricks on storytelling on your smartphone, make sure you like and subscribe. In the future, I'm planning to do a deep dive into Cinema P3 and explore how you can best utilize that app, in addition to covering techniques and walkthroughs on how to best capture all the elements of your stories. So drop a subscribe. To test out the filters, I took my lovely model into the backyard during the brightest and hottest part of the day. Thankfully, the heat index was only about 110 degrees, so just a walk in the park. The overall lighting's not what I would recommend for a typical talking head shot, but I used this spot to showcase the impact of a full sun on overall camera settings. First, I wanted to explore using the filters with the stock video application included with my iPhone. The settings were 4K at 24 frames a second, but not using ProRes video. I let the phone have full control as I shot, only setting my focus and the level of the ND filter physically on the phone. You'll see that the phone makes a few adjustments throughout, but overall you're able to see how the ND filter interacts with the phone's image. Next, I did a similar test on Cinema P3. For this test, I set all of my settings to the ideal settings for filmmaking: 24 frames a second, 1/48th shutter speed, and the lowest ISO I could get since I was outdoors. This test shows why the ND filter is important. You can see how the image goes from significantly overexposed at first to ideal as I tested each filter and the ND settings. I hit the sweet spot for these settings around 7 or 8 stops of ND. Next, you can see how the ND filter interacts with cinematic mode on the iPhone, both filming without the ND filter as well as with it. I noticed that the shadows look much nicer with the ND filter, but since it was 8 stops of ND filtering, it had a slight color shift that I don't love. Ideally, I would love to have jumped down to 7 stops where the color shift is much nicer, but it was honestly hard to tell in the moment. Finally, here's the real test. I filmed footage of my wife waving in 60 frames a second and then slowed it down to 24 frames a second in my editor. This gave me some nice slow motion footage, but more importantly, it allows you to see how the shutter speed interacts with the motion blur. First, I went through each of the stops using the stock app. You can see how the motion blur gets smoother as I increase the ND filter, and the phone was able to adjust the shutter speed. Then I once again set the settings to the optimal spot on Cinema P3, 60 frames a second with a 1/120th shutter. The only difference is that this time I let the phone set the ISO levels on its own, since I wasn't worried about it ever setting my ISO to level it was too bright. You'll notice on these how the motion blur is much smoother, and it's just a matter of me dialing in the correct amount of ND to control my lighting. Overall, I love these filters. An ND filter allows you to set your camera exactly where you'd like it, and if you're using the stock app, then at least the phone has a fighting chance of hitting the right settings for filmmaking. In terms of quality, the impact these have to the color overall is great at the lower stops, and I found that they introduced a healthy amount of softening to take off just a bit of the digital edge of the phone's look. The biggest issue I ran into is that you lose a little bit of quality if you utilize the 1 to 5 stop filter at 4 to 5 stops and the 6 to 9 filter at 8 or 9 stops. 1 to 3 stops have little to no impact on the overall color of the image, while 4 to 5 stops start to introduce a slightly orange hue to your image, really bad at 5. Meaning the 6 to 9 tends to get that color cast at 8 or 9 stops. The filters also meant that my camera at least had a fighting chance getting the best settings when I'm filming at 60 frames a second to give me better looking slow motion footage. The reason shutter speed matters is because it affects the amount and the look of the motion blur in your shots. It's not as obvious at 24 frames a second, but it is there. But as soon as you slow it down, then the shutter speed that's off is going to be more noticeable. I often find myself filming B-roll at 60 frames a second to then slow it down to 24 frames a second, so that makes shutter speed even more important. Regarding the very slight color shifting in some of the settings, I'd be interested to see if this could be minimized using an app like Cinema P3, where you can add tint to your white balance and slightly shift the overall color. I didn't get a chance to play with this in my initial testing, but it's something I do plan to use in the future and see if I can offset that. In terms of real-world usage for these filters, I would say that you could safely use the VND 1 to 5 stop filter at about 1 to 4 stops. But if you do need 5 stops of ND, then I would make the jump to the 6 to 9 filter and then put it right at the bottom at 6 stops. Then I wouldn't go beyond 7 stops and just make adjustments to your shutter if you need to. This is going to give you the least amount of color shift while allowing you to stay as close to optimal settings as possible. I wasn't able to test out the other accessories in the Sherpa line, but Freewell has a number of other accessories that can extend your creativity. They offer both the variable ND filters in a mist variety, giving them a little more softer and vintage-like look. Similarly, they offer both a snow mist and a glow mist filter to soften your footage and give them a vintage look in slightly different ways. Additionally, they have a circular polarizer, which basically just helps you to minimize reflections on windows and water. If you want to get even more creative, they offer anamorphic lens sets that create either blue or gold flares if you're wanting to channel your inner J.J. Abrams. These anamorphic lenses include their own snap-on ND filters as well, and the lenses snap directly onto the case right over the phone's lenses. Finally, and the item I'm most excited to try out, is the Bluetooth grip. I'm a big fan of using grips when filming in landscape mode on my phone, but I found that the 2 grips I typically use will get in the way of these variable ND filters. Enter the Bluetooth grip. It clips onto the phone on one side and gives you a more traditional grip similar to a higher end camera. Additionally, it provides a Bluetooth connection where you can remote trigger your recordings. Finally, the base can extend to more of a selfie stick if that's something you want to try out. Just throwing this out there, Freewell. I would be happy to review any of these items or anything new if you send them my way. The Freewell Sherpa case and variable ND filters are a great tool to have in your tool belt. The speed of use and overall quality means that you can set your phone settings exactly where you need them. Even if you're using the stock application and allowing it to handle most of your settings on its own, the only way the phone can hit the optimal settings in certain scenarios is if you use some sort of ND filter. Are these perfect? Of course not, but few tools are. But considering the overall price of the filters and the case, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better option in the market at this price point. Look, these aren't a necessity of storytelling, but they're an additional tool that can help you to improve the quality of your filmmaking. If you're interested in learning techniques and tips for telling stories on your smartphone, make sure you subscribe. And as always, remember, it's not about the gear, it's about the story.